From the late 1800s into the 1930s, somewhere between a third and half of all American city dwellers either took in boarders or lived as one. For $4 to $7 a week, a working person got a clean room and 3 meals at a common table. And the heart of every one of those houses was the same: the boarding house landlady, a widow or a wife stretching a few dollars into supper for a dozen hungry strangers. She set out platters of fried chicken, bowls of butter beans, hot cobbler, and biscuits passed hand to hand. Number 16 on this list filled a whole table for pennies a plate. Number 12 was the dishboarders argued over for the last helping. And number 5 on this list could quiet a room full of tired men in one bite. Here's the strange part. These suppers once fed half a country, then slipped out of memory completely. So hit subscribe and pull up a chair, because here are 25 forgotten boarding house suppers for seniors who remember real home cooking. Number 25, the boiled dinner. Ask anyone who paid $4 a week for room and board, and this was the meal that turned up most. A piece of cheap, salted beef went into one big pot with cabbage, carrots, turnips, and potatoes, and it simmered most of the afternoon while the landlady did everything else. It cost almost nothing and stretched to feed a dozen working men with seconds left over. The genius was in the leftovers. Whatever beef and vegetables did not get eaten at supper got chopped fine and fried into a hash for the next morning. So a single piece of meat did double duty across 2 meals. Nobody called it fancy. It was honest food, the kind that filled you up after a 10-hour shift and asked for nothing in return. Today, most folks would not know how to start one because the cut of beef it needs has all but vanished from the meat case. That is a shame, because the boiled dinner fed more Americans than almost anything else on this list. Number 24, creamed chipped beef on toast. Meat was a luxury in a house full of boarders, so the smart cook learned to make a little go a long way. Dried salted beef was shaved paper thin, soaked to pull out some of the salt, then folded into a thick white sauce and spooned over toasted bread. A few cents of dried beef could feed the whole table, and the milk gravy did the rest of the work. Soldiers ate so much of it in 2 world wars that they gave it a barracks nickname too crude to repeat here. But back at the boarding house, it was simply supper on a tight week. It was salty, warm, and stuck to your ribs, exactly what a tired worker wanted on a cold night. You can still find the little jars of dried beef if you hunt, but almost nobody reaches for them anymore. Creamed chipped beef was thrift you could taste, and it kept countless tables fed when the meat money ran low. Number 23, Salisbury steak. Long before it showed up in a frozen tray, this was a clever way to make ground beef feel like a real cut of meat. The dish takes its name from Dr. James Salisbury, who pushed beef patties on Union soldiers during the Civil War, and the name stuck in print by the 1880s. In a boarding house, it was a gift. A pound of cheap ground beef got stretched with breadcrumbs and onion, shaped into oval patties, browned and drowned in brown onion gravy. The gravy hid the fact that there was more filler than beef, and the boarders never minded. Served over mashed potatoes, it looked generous and tasted rich for pennies a plate. It carried the same trick into cafeterias and army mess halls for decades. These days, the name only survives on a freezer box most seniors would rather forget. The real homemade Salisbury steak deserved better than that quiet ending. Number 22, oyster stew. It is hard to believe now, but there was a stretch of years when oysters were so plentiful and cheap that they counted as poor folks' food. Up and down the East Coast, a bowl of oyster stew was a common supper. Just oysters gently warmed in milk or cream with butter and a little pepper, ready in minutes. Irish Catholic families leaned on it for meatless nights and made it their Christmas Eve tradition, and from there it spread across the whole country. A boarding house near the water could set out a steaming tureen of it for almost nothing and call it a feast. Old cookbooks from before the Second World War were stuffed with oyster recipes because the shellfish were everywhere. Then the beds got fished out, the price climbed, and oysters turned into a treat for special occasions. Most younger people have never tasted a real oyster stew. It went from everyday supper to forgotten luxury in a single lifetime. Number 21, liver and onions. Mention it today, and half the room makes a face, but in the boarding house era, this was treasured because it was both cheap and filling. Liver was one of the least expensive things at the butcher, often the part nobody else wanted, so the landlady could buy plenty of it. She sliced it thin, dusted it in flour, and seared it fast in a hot pan, then buried it under a heap of onions cooked slow and sweet in the drippings. The onions did the heavy lifting, turning a plain organ meat into something glossy and savory that clung to a pile of mashed potatoes. It gave hard-working bodies real iron and strength, which mattered when the day was all heavy lifting. Children of that time learned to clean their plates whether they liked it or not. Now it has slipped off nearly every menu in the country. Liver and onions fed strong workers cheaply, and few dishes worked harder for the money. Number 20. Scalloped potatoes and ham. This was the dish a landlady made when she needed to feed everyone from one pan and have it stretch. Thin slices of potato got layered in a baking dish with flour, salt, and milk, then dotted with whatever scraps of ham were left from an earlier meal. An hour in the oven turned it into a bubbling, golden, creamy supper that smelled like home from the front porch. A little leftover ham flavored the whole thing, so a few ounces of meat fed a crowd. It belonged to the same family of plain, hearty fare that filled boarding house tables: meatloaf, beef stew, pot roast, and pies of every kind. The boarders sat at one long common table and passed the dish hand to hand until the pan scraped empty. It was warm, cheap, and deeply satisfying, the kind of food that made a rented room feel a little less lonely. Scalloped potatoes and ham proved that thrift and comfort could sit on the same plate. Number 19. Corned beef hash. Nothing got wasted in a house run on a tight budget, and hash was proof of that. The morning after a boiled dinner, the cook took the leftover corned beef and potatoes, chopped them fine, and pressed the whole mess into a hot, greased skillet. She let it sit until a dark crust formed underneath, then flipped it in pieces so the crispy bits got spread all through. Sometimes a fried egg went on top, and that turned a plate of scraps into something a hungry man looked forward to. It was the second life of last night's supper, and it cost the landlady nothing at all. Boarders learned that the crust was the whole point, and the ones who got the corner pieces counted themselves lucky. For decades, this was how working families squeezed 2 meals out of 1 piece of meat. The tinned version still sits on shelves, but the real skillet hash, made from honest leftovers, has mostly disappeared. Corned beef hash was frugality you could be proud to serve. By the way, real quick before we get to number 18, if these old boarding house suppers are bringing back memories, we have pulled a good many of them together into a recipe guide so you can make them in your own kitchen again. You will find the link down in the description under this video. Now, back to the countdown. Number 18. Stewed tomatoes over bread. Here is a supper that turned almost nothing into a warm, filling plate. Canned or fresh tomatoes were simmered down with a little onion, thickened with flour, and sweetened just a touch, then tossed with torn squares of day-old bread until the bread soaked up every bit of the juice. Some cooks baked it like a savory pudding, others spooned it hot over mashed potatoes, rice, or grits. Either way, it stretched a few tomatoes and the heel of a loaf into a dish that fed the whole table for pennies. It used up stale bread that would otherwise have gone to waste, which mattered when every crumb was counted. The taste was sweet, tangy, and comforting on a cold evening. Younger folks today have never even heard of it. Stewed tomatoes over bread was poverty cooking at its most clever, and it never let anyone leave the table hungry. Number 17. Welsh Rarebit. Despite the fancy-sounding name, this was a poor man's supper dressed up just enough to feel like a treat. A sharp cheese sauce, loosened with a splash of beer or milk and seasoned with mustard, was poured bubbling hot over thick slices of toast. That was the whole dish. Melted cheese on bread, but done right, it was rich and savory and surprisingly satisfying. For a boarding house cook, it was a blessing on a meatless night, because a small wedge of cheese and a loaf of bread could feed everyone. It came over from Britain and settled comfortably into American supper tables, where folks served it for a light evening meal or a late snack. It filled bellies without touching the meat budget at all. The dish slowly faded as cheaper convenience foods crowded it out. Welsh rarebit was humble comfort that made a plain slice of toast feel like something special. Number 16, the landlady's fried chicken. This is the platter that filled a whole table for pennies a plate, the one we opened the door on at the start. On a good week, the boarding house cook would buy up the cheaper cuts of chicken, soak them, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them golden in a heavy iron skillet until the whole house smelled like Sunday. Out it came on a big platter at the center of the common table, set beside biscuits passed hand to hand and bowls of butter beans and hot cobbler. One chicken, cut up small and fried crisp, could feed a dozen hungry boarders who had been working since dawn. The crackle of that crust and the warmth of those past biscuits were what turned a house full of strangers into something close to a family for an hour. Today, fried chicken comes from a bucket under bright lights. The landlady's skillet version, made for a room full of tired workers, is the one worth remembering. Number 15, stewed prunes. To modern ears, this sounds more like medicine than dessert, but on a boarding house table it was the sweet, gentle finish to a heavy meal. Drying plums was a cheap way to keep summer fruit through the long, cold months, so a sack of prunes sat in nearly every pantry. The cook soaked them, then simmered them slow in a little water with sugar until they swelled up soft and syrupy. Spooned warm into a bowl, sometimes with a splash of cream, they cost next to nothing and rounded off supper with something sweet. They turned up at breakfast too, beside the oatmeal, doing double duty the way every thrifty food did. For a generation that grew up before refrigerators, this was simply what dessert tasted like. Younger people today wrinkle their noses at the very idea. Stewed prunes were humble comfort, and they sweetened more hard winters than anyone bothered to count. Number 14, chicken and dumplings. When an older hen had stopped laying, the boarding house cook knew exactly what to do with it. The tough old bird went into a big pot and simmered for hours until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. Then came the dumplings, soft pillows of flour and a little fat dropped right into the bubbling pot or rolled flat and cut into strips depending on what part of the country you came from. They puffed up and soaked in the broth until the whole thing was thick and warming. A single tough chicken, too old for anything else, fed the entire table this way and wasted nothing. It was slow food, the kind that needed a cook with time and patience, which is part of why it has faded. Most kitchens today reach for a quick rotisserie bird instead. Chicken and dumplings was the dish that proved patience, and a cheap hen could make something nobody ever forgot. Number 13, ham loaf. Picture a meatloaf but built from the ends and trimmings of a ham that would otherwise have gone to waste, and you have the idea. Leftover cooked ham was ground up, mixed with a little fresh pork, bound with breadcrumbs and egg, then pressed into a pan and baked low and slow. Many cooks brushed it with a sweet glaze of brown sugar and mustard, so the outside turned sticky and the inside stayed tender. It made a few dollars of ham scraps look like a proper Sunday roast on the common table. Sliced thick, it fed a houseful and tasted even better cold the next day in a sandwich, which kept the leftovers earning their keep. It belonged to the great tradition of boarding house thrift, where nothing was thrown out and every scrap found a second purpose. Church suppers and family reunions carried it on for years after the boarding houses closed. Ham loaf turned the humblest leftovers into the centerpiece of the table, and that was no small trick. Number 12, split pea soup with ham hock. This is the one boarders argued over for the last helping, the dish we promised you back at the start. After a ham had been picked clean, the bone never went in the trash. It went straight into a tall pot with a sack of dried split peas, an onion, and whatever bits of meat still clung to the bone. Then it simmered all day on the back of the stove while the landlady tended to everything else. By supper, the peas had melted into a thick green puree you could nearly stand a spoon in, rich with smoke from the hock. A nickel bag of dried peas and a bone nobody else wanted fed a house full of laborers who needed a meal that burned slow through long hours of cold outdoor work. The steelmen and the dock workers ran on bowls like this. It cost almost nothing and warmed a body to the bone. Split pea soup with ham hock turned the last scrap of a ham into the meal everyone fought to finish. Number 11. The Saturday night common table supper. Of every meal that came out of a boarding house kitchen, this was the one the whole week pointed toward. Saturday was the night the landlady went a little further because Sunday meant church and rest, and the boarders had been paid. She had spent the week stretching scraps into hash and gravy, but on Saturday a cheaper roast went into the oven in the late afternoon, surrounded by potatoes and carrots and onions that soaked up the drippings as it cooked. The smell of it crept up the stairs and pulled tired men down to the dining room early, hats in hand, waiting at the long table before the platter even arrived. When it did, the landlady carved it thin so it would reach every plate, and not a soul complained about the size of his slice, because the gravy and the bread filled in the rest. Around that table sat a mill hand, a young clerk far from home, a widower with no kitchen of his own, and a traveling salesman passing through. They were strangers on Monday. By Saturday, passing the potatoes hand to hand under one lamp, they had become something closer to a family, at least for the length of a meal. The landlady ate last, if she ate at all, watching the platters empty and counting in her head what Sunday's leftovers would have to cover. That roast became cold sandwiches, then soup, then a hash, until the bone itself went into a pot. Nothing about the supper was fancy, and that was the whole point. It was warm. It was generous in spirit, if not in portion, and for a room full of people with nowhere else to be, it was the closest thing to home that money could rent. The Saturday common table supper fed the body cheaply and the loneliness even more cheaply, and that was the real magic of the boarding house. Number 10. Boston baked beans and brown bread. Saturday night in a New England house meant a heavy crock of beans had been baking low in the oven since morning. Dried navy beans went in with salt pork, molasses, and a little mustard, then cooked slow for hours until they turned soft and sweet and the sauce went dark as syrup. Alongside came brown bread, a dense loaf of rye, cornmeal, and more molasses, steamed upright in an empty coffee can until it slid out in a perfect cylinder. A few cents of dried beans and pantry staples fed a full table and left plenty for a bean sandwich the next day. The whole thing could sit warm in the oven for hours, which suited a cook who also had Saturday chores to finish. It was filling, frugal, and so woven into the week that whole towns ran bean suppers in church halls. Boston baked beans and brown bread were thrift turned into ritual, and almost no one steams that bread in a can anymore. Number 9. Codfish cakes. Salt cod was once one of the cheapest things a coastal cook could buy, dried stiff as a board and keeping for months without ice. The landlady soaked a piece overnight to draw out the salt, then flaked it and mashed it together with boiled potato, an egg, and a little onion. She shaped the mix into patties and fried them golden in a hot skillet until the edges crisped. A small piece of preserved fish stretched into a platter that fed the whole table, which made it a blessing on Friday nights when Catholic boarders kept to meatless meals. By the 1920s, factories in Gloucester were canning the things by the tens of thousands a day, an early convenience food for busy kitchens. The homemade version, fried fresh and served with a squeeze of lemon, was far better than anything from a tin. Codfish cakes fed thrifty coastal tables for generations, then quietly slipped off the supper menu for good. Number 8. Beef tongue. Modern shoppers walk right past it, but the boarding house cook knew it was one of the best bargains in the whole meat case. The butcher practically gave it away, because few city families knew what to do with it. She simmered the tongue for hours with onion and a few peppercorns until it grew fork tender, then peeled away the tough outer skin and sliced the meat thin across the grain. Underneath that homely exterior was beef as rich and tender as a good roast, and it could be served hot with mustard sauce or pressed and chilled for cold sandwiches all week. One tongue fed a crowd for the price of the cheapest cut on the rail. It was the kind of thrift that took a little nerve and a lot of patience, both of which a good landlady had in supply. Beef tongue gave hard-working boarders fine eating at scrap prices, and today most people would not dare to try it. Number 7. Baked macaroni and cheese. Forget the creamy stovetop bowl most people picture today, because the old boarding house version was a baked casserole built in layers. The cook boiled her macaroni, then stacked it in a dish with grated cheddar and breadcrumbs, layer upon layer the way you would build a small lasagna. Over the top went a pour of milk, a scatter of more crumbs, and a few dots of butter before the whole thing baked until the surface turned brown and crisp. A handful of cheese and a box of dry pasta fed the entire table, which made it a meatless night savior on a thin week. It came out firm enough to cut into squares and hand around, golden on top and soft beneath. Children and tired workers alike cleaned their plates of it without a word of complaint. Baked macaroni and cheese was humble, filling, and far closer to a custard than the gooey stuff that took its name in later years. Number 6. Fried cornmeal mush. Few suppers stretched further on less money than a pot of plain cornmeal and water. The night before, the cook boiled cornmeal with water and a little salt until it thickened into a soft porridge, then poured it into a loaf pan and set it in the cold pantry to firm up overnight. Come morning or evening, she turned the solid block out, sliced it into slabs, and fried them in a little bacon grease until each piece went crisp and golden outside while staying creamy within. Served hot with molasses or sorghum poured over the top, it filled a hungry belly for pennies a plate. It was a trick borrowed from generations of frontier and farm kitchens where cornmeal was often the cheapest thing in the house. Boarders ate it for supper one day and breakfast the next without ever feeling cheated. Fried cornmeal mush proved that a sack of cheap meal in a hot pan could feed a whole house when the money ran thin. Number 5. Bread pudding. This is the dish that could quiet a room full of tired men in a single bite, just as we promised at the start. No thrifty kitchen ever threw out stale bread, and this is where the heels and dry slices went to live a second life. The cook tore the old bread into a dish, poured over a custard of milk, eggs, sugar, and a little vanilla, then folded in a handful of raisins if the pantry had them. Into the oven it went until the top caramelized golden and the center set soft and creamy. A few cents of stale bread and some pantry staples turned into a warm, comforting dessert that tasted far richer than its cost. Spooned out hot, maybe with a thread of warm sauce, it sent men back upstairs full and content after a long shift. It used up what would have gone to waste and made it feel like a treat. Bread pudding was frugality at its sweetest, the dessert that closed a hard day on a soft note. Number 4. Beef heart stew. Of all the bargains at the butcher counter, few beat the heart, a dense and lean cut sold for a fraction of the price of a steak. The cook trimmed it down, cut it into chunks, and browned it hard before letting it simmer for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes in a rich brown gravy. Long, slow cooking was the secret, because it turned a tough working muscle into something tender and deeply beefy, closer to a fine roast than anyone expected from so cheap a cut. One heart made a heavy pot of stew that fed the whole table and stuck to the ribs of men headed back into the cold. It carried real flavor and real strength for the price of pocket change. Most shoppers today would not recognize it in the case if they saw it. Beef heart stew was hearty eating at scrap prices, and it filled more working bellies than anyone kept track of. Number 3. Indian pudding. Born in the cold kitchens of early New England, this slow-baked cornmeal dessert warmed boarding house tables through the worst of winter. The cook stirred cornmeal into scalded milk, sweetened it heavy with dark molasses, and spiced it with ginger and cinnamon before sliding it into a low oven for hours. It baked down into a dark, soft, almost custardy pudding, somewhere between a porridge and a cake, with a deep, earthy sweetness that came from the molasses rather than costly white sugar. Served warm, often with a spoon of cream or a scoop of ice cream melting into it, it was the kind of dessert that made a freezing night feel survivable. The long bake meant a cook could set it going and forget it while she handled supper. It cost little more than meal, milk, and molasses, all cheap staples kept on hand. Indian pudding was old-fashioned even 100 years ago, and today hardly a soul still bakes it. Number 2. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Immigrant cooks from Eastern Europe and beyond carried this dish into American boarding houses where it fit the budget perfectly. A little ground meat got stretched with rice, onion, and seasoning, then spooned onto softened cabbage leaves and rolled into tidy bundles. The rolls were packed tight into a pot, covered in a tangy tomato sauce and simmered low until the cabbage went meltingly tender and the filling cooked through. A small amount of cheap meat, patted out with rice and wrapped in a head of cabbage, fed a long table and tasted like far more than it cost. The whole thing could be built ahead and left to bubble while the cook saw to other work. It carried the flavors of the old country into a rented dining room, where boarders of every background passed the platter and asked for the recipe. Stuffed cabbage rolls turned a few cents of meat and a cabbage into a supper that ate like a feast. Number 1. The Boarding House Mulligan Stew. At the very top of the list sits the dish that captures the whole spirit of the boarding house in one pot. Mulligan stew had no fixed recipe at all. It was whatever the kitchen had on hand, simmered together until it made a meal. A few scraps of cheap meat, the soft potatoes, the limp carrots, the half an onion, the heel of a cabbage, even the leftovers from 2 nights back. All of it went into one big pot with water and a little seasoning and cooked down into something hot and filling. No 2 pots were ever the same, because no 2 weeks left the same odds and ends behind. That was the genius of it. Nothing was wasted and everyone was fed, which was the landlady's entire job boiled down to a single kettle. It stretched the last dollar of the week as far as a dollar could go and sent a house full of strangers to bed warm. The Mulligan stew was the truest boarding house supper of them all, the dish that turned absolutely nothing into enough. Number 19. Cabbage and salt pork. A head of cabbage cost 9 cents in 1963. A quarter pound of salt pork cost about 12 cents. Together in a single pot, covered with water and simmered for an hour, they became something that fed a table of 6 for under 25 cents total. In the German farming communities of central Missouri and the Czech settlements of South Texas, the pot liquor from the cabbage was considered as valuable as the cabbage itself. Children were given the broth in a cup like a drink. Nothing was left in the pot. That's how cheap and effective this meal was. The salt pork flavored everything it touched, and when you pulled it out after cooking, whatever meat clung to the bone was divided between the smallest children first. The woman at the pot didn't have to be told that. It wasn't discussed. It was understood. You fed the young ones from what was closest to the bone. Back in those days, that was just how it worked. Number 2. Skillet mac and cheese. Long before the blue Kraft box arrived in every grocery in 1937, American grandmothers were making mac and cheese on the stovetop in a single pan. Boil a half pound of dry elbow macaroni right in 2 cups of whole milk with a knob of butter and a hard shake of salt. Stir often. When the noodles softened 15 minutes in, the milk had thickened into a starchy sauce. Off the heat. Stir in 2 big handfuls of grated sharp cheddar from the brick wrapped in waxed paper in the icebox. The cheese melted in the residual heat. A crack of black pepper. That was supper for 4 children and a tired mother in one pan in 1953 with no oven heat in a hot July kitchen. Number 21. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The military gave it a name that cannot be printed here. Mothers kept it clean. Thin slices of dried beef, salt-cured and almost leathery, torn into strips and dropped into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, poured over thick slices of white toast. That was supper. In working-class neighborhoods across Ohio and Pennsylvania, and in mill towns from the Piedmont to the Monongahela Valley, this was a weeknight staple from the 1940s all the way through the 1960s. A jar of dried beef cost 35 cents in 1965. It fed 4 people over toast. The roux had to be stirred constantly or it scorched, which is why every woman who made it stood at the stove the whole time. There were no shortcuts. The white sauce either came together smooth or it didn't. Most mothers could tell by the smell when it was right. They didn't use a timer, they just knew. That is a kind of skill you can't buy. Number 13. Spanish rice with hamburger. This was the pot that needed nothing more than 1 onion, a half cup of rice, and whatever meat was wrapped in paper at the bottom of the icebox. Brown a half pound of ground beef in her deep skillet. Drop in the chopped onion. Add a half cup of dry, long-grain rice straight from the cardboard box. Pour in a can of stewed tomatoes and a cup of water. A shake of paprika from the red tin. Lid on. 25 minutes on the lowest flame. The rice drank the tomato juice, the meat scraps stretched themselves across a family of 5, and the supper cost about 40 cents in 1958 money. Texas grandmothers cooked it on weeknights and called it Spanish rice without ever crossing the border. Beans and Franks was the meal that appeared when the grocery money ran out 3 days before payday, and nobody pretended otherwise. Hot dogs sliced into coins, stirred into a pot of baked beans, sometimes with a squirt of mustard and a spoonful of brown sugar to pull the whole thing together. Some mothers served it over white bread, others just handed you a bowl and a spoon. The kids never complained because those little hot dog rounds made ordinary beans feel like something on purpose. In the 1960s, a can of Van Camp's or B&M baked beans cost about 15 cents, and a package of Oscar Mayer Franks ran 39. For under 60 cents, you fed 4 people a hot meal that stuck to their ribs and left enough for school lunches the next day. There was no shame in it. Every family on the block had a version, and the only real argument was whether you added ketchup or left it alone. The kids who grew up on this meal remember it fondly. The mothers who served it remember why. Number 6. Skillet Hamburger Pie. This was the pot that stretched a single pound of ground beef across 5 plates and a packed lunch. Brown the meat in a deep iron pan with 1 chopped onion. Drain off the grease into the tin can on the stove. Stir in a can of cut green beans straight from the cellar and a can of cream of mushroom soup. Spread the meat flat in the pan. Heap a bowl of mashed potatoes over the top, edge to edge. Slide the whole pan into the oven for 20 minutes until the potato peaks browned. Cut into wedges like a real pie. 1 slice for each child, 1 for the husband, 1 wrapped in waxed paper for the lunch pail next morning. If Welsh rarebit was toast dressed up, Egg's goldenrod was toast in its Sunday best. Simple enough for a child to eat and pretty enough that your mother took a quiet pride in serving it. She hard-boiled the eggs, separated the whites from the yolks, chopped the whites into small pieces, and folded them into a white sauce she made in the same pan she used for everything. That creamy mixture went over buttered toast, and then, the part that gave the dish its name, she pressed the bright yellow yolks through a sieve so they fell like golden dust over the top. The dish was named for the goldenrod wildflower, and in certain Catholic households through the 1950s and 60s, it showed up nearly every Friday when meat was off the table. It cost almost nothing. It fed the whole family. And the woman who made yours probably learned it from her own mother, who learned it from hers, none of them ever writing it down because there was nothing to write. You just knew. Number 14. Poor man's stew. 2 or 3 potatoes, 1 onion, a package of hot dogs sliced into rounds. Browned in a skillet with oil until the potatoes were golden at the edges, then covered with a little water and simmered until everything was soft and the broth had thickened with potato starch. Some families added a can of baked beans at the end. Others added ketchup, which sounds strange until you taste it and understand that the sweetness cut through the starch the way nothing else did. In the small factory towns of West Virginia and along the coal fields of southwestern Virginia, this was called poor man's stew without any embarrassment. Hot dogs cost 29 cents a package in 1965. Potatoes were 5 cents a pound. The whole pot cost under 40 cents. What is remarkable is not that families ate this way. What is remarkable is that it tasted good. It still does. Cheap food works, beautiful in its own honest way. Number 11. Frito Pie Skillet. The Frito-Lay publicity team served Fritos chili pie to the Dallas Dietetic Association in 1949, and the recipe ran on millions of red and yellow bags in 1962. Heat a can of chili, pour it over a pile of corn chips, top with grated cheese and chopped onion. By the late 60s, working mothers in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma were making the skillet version on weeknights when nothing else was thawed. Brown a half pound of ground beef in her seasoned pan. Stir in a can of pinto beans and a small can of tomato sauce with a shake of chili powder. Pile a bag of Fritos right on top of the simmering chili. Cover with a fistful of shredded cheddar. Lid on for 2 minutes to melt the cheese. Spoon it straight from the pan onto 5 plates. Number 18, potato and onion skillet hash. 4 potatoes, 1 onion, bacon grease in the bottom of a cast iron skillet. Your mother sliced the potatoes thin so they cooked fast, laid them flat in the hot grease and pressed them down with a spatula, then left them alone long enough to brown before she turned them. The onions went in halfway through, softening and turning sweet against the crust that had formed on the potatoes. Salt, pepper. That was all it needed. 1 pan, 1 flame. Under a dime. Under a dime. Nothing wasted. In rural communities across Tennessee and Kentucky, fried potatoes and onions was the supper that appeared when there was nothing in the house but the potato sack and the onion bin. A pound of potatoes cost about 5 cents in 1964. The skillet was ready in 20 minutes. Everyone ate until the pan was clean. No stove required beyond a flame and patience. No pots to wash but one. Number 15. Skillet goulash with macaroni. The newspaper printed a recipe called American Goulash back in 1909, where cubed beef got baked with rice, tomato, and onion. By the time the Depression was grinding into its 3rd winter, the recipe had drifted onto a stovetop, and the rice had turned into elbow macaroni. Grandmothers in Ohio mill towns and Indiana farm kitchens cooked it in a deep skillet on the back burner with 1 pound of ground beef, 1 chopped onion, 1 can of tomatoes, 1 can of tomato sauce, and a cup of dry elbows poured right into the same pan with 2 cups of water. Lid on. 22 minutes on a low flame. The starch from the macaroni thickened the sauce without a roux, and the whole supper hit the table in the time it took to set out plates. Some families called it goulash. Some called it just hamburger and noodles. Either way, it was the kind of pot a tired woman could leave alone while she folded a basket of warm laundry on the kitchen chair. If scalloped corn was built for crowds, stuffed green peppers were built for the family table. Each one a small, self-contained meal packed tight and simmered until the pepper walls went soft enough to cut with a fork. Your mother hollowed out the peppers, mixed ground beef with cooked rice and a beaten egg, packed the filling in firm, and set them upright in a deep pot with canned stewed tomatoes poured around the base. The lid went on and the pot simmered for what felt like hours, the kitchen filling with a sweet, beefy steam that clung to the curtains. By the 1960s, stuffed peppers appeared in nearly every women's magazine and community cookbook in America, each version slightly different. Some added Worcestershire sauce, others a handful of shredded cheese on top in the last 5 minutes. The dish required patience more than skill, and the mothers who made it best were the ones who never rushed the simmer. One Quora commenter, remembering the era, wrote simply that her mother simmered them for hours in stewed tomatoes, and that she no longer makes them since her father passed away. Number 17. Hoover Stew. Named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who left office in 1933 with bread lines stretching around city blocks, Hoover stew lived on in American kitchens for 30 more years after the Depression officially ended. Macaroni noodles, sliced hot dogs, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a can of corn. All in one pot. Boil the macaroni, add the rest, let it simmer until the tomatoes had soaked into the pasta. In shantytown communities called Hoovervilles during the 1930s, this exact formula fed hundreds out of community pots. By the 1960s, it had moved, generation by generation, into the kitchens of working-class families in Cleveland and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, where it was just called mac and hot dogs. A package of macaroni was 19 cents in 1965. A can of tomatoes was 15 cents. 4 hot dogs stretched to feed 5 people. That was dinner for under 50 cents. The name Hoover had long since been forgotten. The meal hadn't. Number 4. Skillet pork chops and apples. The pairing was already cemented in American kitchens by the mid-1800s, with a recipe for pork chops and applesauce running in Good Housekeeping in 1893 and another in Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School Cookbook in 1896. German immigrant farm wives in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and the Ozarks made it in one pan because the orchard ripened the week the hogs were slaughtered. Brown 4 thin pork chops in her iron pan with a spoonful of lard. Lift the chops out, slice 2 tart apples into thick rings, drop them into the pork fat, and let them caramelize for 4 minutes. Lay the chops back over the apples. Lid on, lowest flame, 12 minutes. The apples broke down into a sauce. The chops finished tender. There were nights when supper was a bag of frozen peas in white sauce poured over toast, and that was all there was, and nobody said a word about it. Your mother melted butter in a saucepan, whisked in flour, added milk, and stirred until the sauce thickened. The same white sauce she used for a dozen different suppers, always made without measuring, always the right consistency because her hands knew what her eyes could not explain. The peas went in still half frozen, and by the time they warmed through, the sauce had turned pale green from the starch, and the whole thing smelled like butter and something almost sweet. She ladled it over toast and set the plates down without apology. It was not a recipe. It was not even really a dish. It was what you ate when the money was thin and the cupboard was honest about it. Years later, you might try to make it yourself. The same butter, the same flour, the same milk, and it will taste like everything except what you are actually missing. Number 22, tomato gravy on biscuits. When the garden exploded with tomatoes in August and there was nothing else ready to pick, a woman in rural Tennessee or the upland counties of Georgia made tomato gravy. She melted bacon grease in a skillet, added a spoonful of flour and let it brown, then poured in garden tomatoes she had crushed by hand, salt, a pinch of sugar, black pepper. She stirred it until the flour and tomatoes became something thicker, tangier, and more satisfying than either one alone. Poured over split biscuits, it was a full meal. By mid-September, when the tomatoes were coming in faster than they could be canned, families ate this 4 or 5 nights running. It did not feel like poverty food when the tomatoes were that ripe. It felt like the best time of the year. Healthy, filling, free from the garden. Appalachian communities still make tomato gravy today. They don't call it poverty food. They call it summer. The sound of canned salmon patties hitting a skillet of hot butter, that sizzle, that pop of moisture against fat, was one of those kitchen sounds you never forget. A steady, crackling hiss that meant supper was 10 minutes away. Your mother cracked open a tall can of pink salmon, picked through it with a fork to pull out the skin, and mashed the soft bones right in because she said they were good for you, full of calcium. She mixed in a beaten egg, crushed saltine crackers, a squeeze of lemon if there was one, and shaped the patties by hand. Never too thick, never too thin. They fried golden in the skillet, crispy on the outside and soft in the center. And you ate them with ketchup if you were a kid or tartar sauce if you were trying to act grown. The whole meal, salmon patties, canned corn, and instant mashed potatoes, ran about 60 cents in 1963. Every mother had her own ratio of cracker to salmon, and if you asked her how much, she would just say enough. Number 15, rice and gravy. In the bayou country of South Louisiana and the rice farming counties of East Texas, rice and gravy was not a side dish. It was the meal itself. Beef drippings from whatever cut had been cooked the day before, reheated and thickened with flour and water into a brown gravy that soaked into the rice until every grain was dark and glossy. Families in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, ate this 3 nights a week. The pot that made the gravy was the same pot used to cook the rice. 1 burner, 1 pot, 1 meal. The secret, if there was one, was patience over the roux, which required stirring over a medium flame until the flour went from raw to deep brown without burning. Every Cajun grandmother had her own timing for this. None of them wrote it down. You learned it by standing next to her at the stove until the smell was right. That's how the best skills move through generations. Number 9, skillet tamale pie. California ranch wives and Texas farm mothers in the 1930s built this one out of a Mexican idea and an iron pan. Brown a pound of ground beef with a chopped onion in a deep skillet. Stir in a can of stewed tomatoes, a can of whole kernel corn, a fistful of olives if you had a jar in the cellar, and a teaspoon of chili powder. Whisk up a quick cornmeal batter in a separate bowl with 1 egg and a cup of milk. Pour the batter right on top of the simmering meat. Lid on. 20 minutes on a low flame. The cornmeal puffed and set into a soft yellow crown. The recipe ran in Sunset magazine in 1942 and showed up in every junior league cookbook from San Diego to Tulsa by 1955. 1 pan to wash. one supper for a long table. Your father knew this dish by a name that could not be repeated at the dinner table, the one the soldiers called it in the mess halls of World War II, where it showed up on metal trays so often that men dreamed about it decades after they came home. Creamed chipped beef on toast started with a small glass jar of Armour-dried beef, so salty your mother soaked the thin slices in warm water twice before she tore them into pieces and stirred them into a butter and flour roux. Milk turned it into gravy, black pepper finished it, and the whole thing got ladled over toast. White bread, always white bread. By the early 1960s, Stouffer's and Banquet both sold frozen versions in boil-in-bag pouches, but the homemade kind had a richness the freezer aisle could never match. The dish survived because it cost next to nothing and fed a family on pantry staples alone. Your mother made it without apology, and if anyone complained, she reminded them their father ate worse in the Pacific. Number 16. Hamburger gravy over rice. A quarter pound of ground beef, browned in the skillet with a diced onion until it broke into crumbles. A spoonful of flour stirred in to make a roux with the drippings. Beef broth or water added slowly, stirred until a thin brown gravy formed around the meat. Poured over white rice that had been cooked while the gravy came together. In the farming communities of the Mississippi Delta and the rural counties of Arkansas, this was called hamburger gravy, and it was understood that 1/4 pound of meat could feed a family of 5 over rice without anyone walking away hungry. Ground beef cost 49 cents a pound in 1965. A cup of dry rice cost less than a dime. 4 people full for under 30 cents a serving. There is no restaurant in America that has figured out how to charge for that ratio. There never will be. The math doesn't work in their favor. Number 12. Bubble and Squeak. British war brides who married American GIs and shipped over to Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Boston between 1944 and 1947 brought this skillet trick with them. Yesterday's boiled potatoes and yesterday's boiled cabbage went into a hot pan with a generous spoonful of bacon drippings. Press the whole thing flat with the back of a spoon. Let it sit untouched on a medium flame for 6 minutes so a brown crust formed on the bottom. The name came from the sound the cabbage made hissing against the hot iron, which the English had been calling bubble and squeak since at least 1762. Flip the slab once, crust the other side, slide it onto a plate and crack a fried egg on top. Supper out of 2 leftovers and a pat of grease. Chicken fricassee was the kind of supper that made a whole bird last 2 nights, and the broth from the bones could carry you into a third. Your mother cut the chicken into pieces, browned them in butter until the skin turned golden, then built a gravy in the same pan with flour, milk, and the drippings that clung to the bottom. Carrots and celery went in, the lid went on, and the kitchen filled with a slow, savory steam that told you supper was still an hour away. The technique was Old French, brought to American kitchens by way of farmhouse cooking and church supper recipes passed between women who never used the word fricassee. They just called it stewed chicken or chicken and gravy. By the 1960s, it was a weeknight staple in homes where a whole fryer still cost less than $1. The gravy was the thing. Thick, pale, peppery, clinging to egg noodles or spooned over rice. It was the part you remembered long after the woman who stirred it was gone. Number 23. Dried corn soup. After the last ears of summer corn came off the stalks, women across the hill country of Pennsylvania and West Virginia cut the kernels thin and laid them out to dry on old window screens set in the sun. By October, the kernels had shriveled to hard, pale chips with a concentrated sweetness that fresh corn never had. Come November, a handful went into a pot of water with a piece of side meat, an onion, and nothing else. The pot simmered all afternoon while your grandmother worked at something else. By supper, the dried kernels had swollen back up and turned the broth milky and thick. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, among Mennonite and Pennsylvania Dutch families, this was called dried corn soup, and it appeared every winter without fail. The flavor was not like canned corn. It was deeper, almost nutty, the way something tastes when summer has been cooked down to its most honest form. One pot. No stove skill required beyond patience. The women who made it were alive to the fact that summer did not last. They made it last anyway. Number 14. Liver and onion skillet. Beef liver was the cheapest cut at the A&P meat counter in 1953, less than half what a chuck roast brought the same week. German and Polish grandmothers in Milwaukee and Buffalo bought a pound of it on Thursdays and cooked it on Thursday nights when there was nothing else cheap left in the icebox. Dredge thin-sliced liver in flour, seasoned with salt and pepper from the wooden mill on the counter. Slick a big iron pan with a spoonful of bacon grease saved in a tin can on the back of the stove. Lay 2 sliced yellow onions in first and let them go soft and brown for 10 slow minutes. Push the onions to one side. Lay the floured liver in the open hot half of the pan. 3 minutes aside, no more, or it turned to shoe leather. Heap the onions back over the top. 1 supper, 1 pan, 1 dish to wash. The smell of ring bologna frying in a cast iron skillet with sliced potatoes and onions. That is a smell that belongs to a very specific kind of childhood. And if you recognize it, you know exactly where you came from. Ring bologna was a smoked, coarse-ground sausage sold in a horseshoe-shaped loop at the butcher counter or the cold case of any grocery store in Pennsylvania Dutch country, across the Midwest, and through the Upper Plains states. Your mother sliced it into thick rounds, scored the edges so they would not curl, and fried them alongside potatoes that had been cut thin enough to crisp in the rendered fat. Onions went in last, just long enough to soften. The whole supper came out of 1 pan, cost under $1, and fed the family with nothing left over. Eckrich and Usinger's were the brands most families reached for, though in rural areas the ring came from a local smokehouse and tasted like nowhere else. You either grew up on ring bologna suppers or you have never heard of them. Number 13. Beans and weenies. A can of pork and beans, a handful of hot dogs sliced thin, a squirt of yellow mustard, a tablespoon of brown sugar, and sometimes a strip or 2 of bacon laid across the top. Into a pot or a baking dish at 350 for half an hour. That was supper in working-class households from New England to the Pacific Northwest every Saturday night for 30 years. In Boston and Portland, Maine, this tradition ran deep enough that Saturday was simply called Frank and Bean Night in many households. Van Camp's pork and beans sold for 21 cents a can in 1961. A package of 8 hot dogs was 29 cents. 6 people could eat for under 60 cents. Your father called it a good supper. Your mother called it Saturday. It was both, and it wasn't fancy. It didn't try to be. And on Sunday, if there were leftovers, you ate them cold on white bread with yellow mustard, and nobody complained. Number 16. Fried bologna hash. The thick-cut deli bologna from the meat counter cost half what ground beef cost in 1961, and grandmothers in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky knew that down to the penny. Dice a half pound of bologna into rough half-inch cubes on the cutting board next to the sink. Brown it hard in her iron pan until the edges curled and crisped and the kitchen smelled like a diner counter. Add a chopped yellow onion, a diced cold-boiled potato left over from last night, and a hit of black pepper from the tin. Press the whole hash flat with the back of the spoon. Let it crust on the bottom for 4 minutes without moving it. Flip the whole slab once, crack 2 eggs right on top, lid on, 3 more minutes. Supper for 4 out of last night's leftovers, and a tube of cheap lunch meat from the corner store. Welsh Rarebit turned a few slices of bread and a block of sharp cheddar into something that felt almost like a real sit-down dinner, and it took less than 15 minutes from stove to table. Your mother grated the cheese by hand, melted it slow in a saucepan with a splash of milk, a spoonful of dry mustard, and a few shakes of Worcestershire sauce until it went smooth and glossy. That golden sauce got poured thick over toast that had been browned under the broiler, and the whole house smelled like a pub kitchen, warm and sharp and rich. The dish had roots going back to 18th century Wales, where it was called Cos Poby, toasted cheese, and it crossed the Atlantic as a tavern supper before American mothers claimed it for weeknight duty. Despite the name, there was never any rabbit in it. Just cheese, bread, and the kind of quick thinking that turned almost nothing into a meal that everybody cleaned their plate for. Number 24. Cornmeal mush with milk. A pot of water, a cup of cornmeal, a pinch of salt. Stir it until it thickened. Pour it into a bowl with warm milk over the top and a thread of sorghum if you had it. That was supper. In farm communities across southern Indiana and the hill country of southern Ohio, cornmeal mush appeared on the table 3 or 4 nights a week in lean seasons. A pound of yellow cornmeal cost 8 cents in 1963. A family of 5 could eat for under a dime. What most people do not know is that leftover mush was sliced cold the next morning, fried crispy in the same skillet it was cooked in, and eaten with syrup for breakfast. Nothing was wasted. The pot was rinsed, not scrubbed. The cornmeal cooked right down to the bottom would flavor the next batch. That was the whole recipe, and it stretched across 2 meals. Number 3, ham and beans. A pound of dry navy beans cost about 14 cents at the IGA in 1955, and a leftover ham bone with shreds of meat clinging to it was free if you had served the ham on Sunday. Country grandmothers in Kentucky, Tennessee, and southern Illinois built a one-pot Monday supper out of those 2 things. Soak the beans overnight in a crock on the back of the counter, drain them in the morning, drop them into a deep iron pot with the ham bone, a halved yellow onion, a clove of garlic, 2 bay leaves, and enough water to cover by 3 fingers. Slow simmer on the back burner all afternoon while the wringer washer ran in the basement and the sheets hung on the line. 4 hours later, the broth had gone milky and rich, the beans had gone soft, and the meat had fallen off the bone in long shreds. A pan of cornbread baked in the oven during the last 20 minutes. Supper for 7, almost free. If you told someone today that your mother baked a cake with a can of Campbell's tomato soup, they would look at you like you had lost your mind. But in the 1960s, tomato soup cake was a real thing that real women made and real families ate after supper on a Wednesday. The recipe had been circulating since the Depression, when Campbell's printed it on the label to sell more soup, and it worked because the tomato gave the cake a warm, spiced flavor, not unlike carrot cake. Moist, dense, with a sweetness that came from the sugar in the soup itself. Most mothers added cinnamon, cloves, and raisins, then finished it with cream cheese frosting, and if you did not know the secret ingredient, you would never have guessed. The cake doubled as a supper dessert, something sweet to end a cheap meal on a full note. It vanished when convenience cake mixes made from scratch baking feel unnecessary, and with it went one of the strangest and most satisfying tricks the American kitchen ever produced. Number 5, corned beef hash. The dish came out of New England Irish kitchens in the 19th century as a way to use up the boiled corned beef and cabbage from a Sunday dinner. By the 1860s, a cheap restaurant in America was called a hash house, and the cooks behind the counter were hash slingers. Wartime rationing in the early 1940s pushed canned corned beef into every grocery shelf, and grandmothers in Boston, Providence, and Hartford turned it into a one-pan Tuesday supper. Dice the meat, dice a cold boiled potato, dice an onion. Brown the whole pile hard in her iron pan until a dark crust formed on the bottom. Crack 2 eggs right onto the top and lid the pan for 3 minutes. The yolks broke when you cut into the hash, and that was the sauce. It was not chicken, and it never had been. City chicken was cubes of pork and veal threaded onto wooden skewers, breaded, browned in a skillet, and baked slow until the meat went tender enough to pull apart with a fork. The dish came out of Polish and Ukrainian neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit during the Depression, when chicken was a luxury that only farm families could afford and pork scraps were cheap at the butcher counter. By the 1960s, actual chicken had become affordable, but city chicken had already earned its place on the weekly rotation in Great Lakes households. Mothers kept making it because their mothers had made it, and the taste was nothing like real poultry anyway. It was richer, fattier, and the breading held a brown gravy that you spooned over mashed potatoes until the plate was swimming. Butcher shops in Pittsburgh still sold the pre-skewered meat in wax paper packages through the 70s. If you grew up east of the Mississippi and never heard of it, that is exactly the point. This was a dish that belonged to the families who made it and nobody else. Number 8, skillet Spam hash. Hormel started canning Spam in 1937 in Austin, Minnesota, and by 1944 the company was shipping 15 million cans a week to American troops in the Pacific. When the boys came home, they wanted the taste of the chow line on a Saturday night, and their mothers and young wives obliged. Dice a half can of Spam into rough cubes on the wooden board, brown them hard in her iron pan until the edges caramelized and the kitchen smelled like the inside of a mess tent. Add a chopped cold boiled potato. Add a yellow onion diced fine. Press the hash flat. Let it crust on the bottom for 4 minutes without touching it. Flip the slab once. Crust the other side. Crack 2 eggs right onto the top. Lid on, 3 minutes. Hawaiian grandmothers cooked the same hash on Sundays after church and called it home. Nobody in the house called it American goulash. It was just the skillet or that macaroni thing or whatever name your family gave the one-pan supper that showed up every other Thursday. Elbow macaroni, ground beef browned with onion, a can of stewed tomatoes, and sometimes a handful of whatever cheese was getting hard in the back of the refrigerator. In New England, they called it American chop suey, though it had nothing to do with anything Chinese. In the Midwest, it was just goulash, though a real Hungarian cook would not have recognized a single thing about it. The secret was the stewed tomatoes. You used Del Monte or Hunt's and you never drained them because that juice was your sauce. The pot sat on the stove and kids served themselves seconds and thirds. Nobody plated it, nobody garnished it, nobody called it a recipe. It was just what you ate on the nights nobody had time to think. Number 1. Skillet sausage gravy and biscuits. This was the supper a Southern grandmother made on the worst nights, when she had been on her feet since 5 in the morning and could not face one more minute of fuss at a stove. Brown a half-pound of breakfast sausage in her iron pan. Sprinkle a heaping tablespoon of flour over the meat. Stir it into the grease until the flour turned the color of sand. Pour in 2 cups of whole milk. Whisk slow until the gravy thickened around the bits of sausage. Salt and a hard crank of black pepper. Drop spoonfuls of buttermilk biscuit dough right onto the simmering gravy. Lid the pan and walk away for 12 minutes. The biscuits steamed open and turned fluffy on top. 1 pan, 1 spoon. She sat down with a plate of it in her own chair at the head of the table, and for the first time since the rooster crowed, nobody was asking her for anything. The whole point of Swiss steak was violence, controlled, deliberate, necessary violence against a cheap cut of round steak that would otherwise chew like shoe leather. Your mother laid the meat on a cutting board, pounded flour into both sides with the edge of a heavy plate or a metal meat mallet, and kept pounding until the fibers broke down and the flour worked itself deep into the grain. Then into the hot skillet it went, browned hard on both sides, before she covered it with canned tomatoes, sliced onions, and sometimes a chopped green pepper. The lid went on, and the steak braised low and slow until it surrendered, fork tender, falling apart in a thick, tomatoey sauce that was almost a gravy. The name had nothing to do with Switzerland. It came from the technique of Swissing, an industrial process of smoothing cloth between heavy rollers, which described exactly what the pounding did to the meat. A 2-pound round steak cost under $1 in 1964, and when your mother was done with it, it tasted like something that should have cost $5. Corned beef hash from a can became an unlikely hero for seniors who needed hot, filling meals without the fuss of extensive preparation. The rectangular cans lined grocery store shelves at budget-friendly prices, containing a mixture of corned beef and potatoes that transformed when properly cooked. The secret was patience, spreading the hash in a hot, greased skillet and leaving it alone until a dark, crispy crust formed on the bottom. That crust was the prize, shattering against the teeth before giving way to the soft, savory interior. A fried egg placed on top turned it into a complete meal, the runny yolk creating an instant sauce that coated every bite. Seniors living alone appreciated that a single can provided 2 generous servings, each one satisfying enough to carry them through to the next meal. The dish required only a skillet and a few minutes of attention, making it perfect for those days when cooking felt like too much effort. Corned beef hash proved that convenience and comfort could coexist beautifully. Before casseroles took over every weeknight, your mother made tuna roll-ups, and if you have not thought about them in 40 years, this is the one that will stop you cold. She rolled out biscuit dough thin, spread canned tuna across it like filling on a jelly roll, and rolled the whole thing up tight before slicing it into rounds. Those rounds went into a baking dish, got covered with cream of mushroom soup thinned with a little milk, and baked until the biscuit dough puffed golden and the cream sauce bubbled around the edges. The meal came together in 20 minutes and cost almost nothing. A can of tuna, a tube of biscuit dough, or a batch from scratch, and a can of soup. You ate it with mashed potatoes and green beans from a can, and the plate looked like something out of a women's magazine from 1962. Nobody makes tuna roll-ups anymore. Most of those women are gone now, and the dish slipped away with them so quietly that nobody even noticed. Pick one of these old suppers and make it this week. Start easy: a pot of split pea soup with a ham hock or a crock of Boston baked beans. And when it is ready, do one thing the Borders always did. Sit at the table to eat it, not on the couch in front of a screen. Food like this was never about the food. It was about tired people gathered under one lamp, becoming a family for the length of a meal. Tell us down below which of these suppers your family still remembers. Maybe the Saturday roast carved thin to reach every plate, or the bread pudding that quieted the whole table. These dishes fed a country once, forgotten now only because nobody passed the pot.